In this video, I'm going to talk about Git installation and initial setup, and also how to create a Git repository, local Git repository. So before we start, I want to explain how Git works. So unlike some other version control systems, Git is a distributed version control system. A bunch of people working together, and there's a server with the Git repository, which is remote. So this Git repository have the history of all of your source code. And anybody can make a clone or copy the whole history of this remote Git repository onto his computer. So every user, all the say 5 users, have a full history of all the historical commits. So if one person screws up, or even if the server screws up, as long as there's one guy who has this Git repository, that Git repository should have all the historical versions up to his latest pull. So he can still restore most of the code. So this is a very safe and secure version control system, especially because it's distributed. Every client has a full history of the snapshots or commits. He can just work locally. So there's no network delay or anything. Even if you are not connected to the internet, you can still work on Git, which is a huge convenience. Now let's talk about downloading. Depending on the operating system, under Linux, this is Fedora. It's just a one-line code, sudo dnf install git. That's it. Under Windows, you download the exe file, and on Mac OS, it's a different line of code. So I won't elaborate on how to install Git. It should be super easy. Check out your documentation, depending on your operating system, obviously. So after you install, you can check the version of the Git, like under Linux, Git version shows you, okay, this is the current version. And you can also, the first thing you want to do is git config, global and username, and write your name, blah, blah, blah. And another thing is user email. You can write your email without the quotes, like blah, blah, blah at blah, blah, blah.com or something. So the global option basically tells Git that for this user logged into this operating system, this global username and email will apply. So your Git documentation will use your name and your email. Another option is system, and you can also to create a username and email without any options. So with the system option, you are creating a username and email for everybody logging onto this computer. This is generally not done. And without any options, without global, without system, you are creating a username and email for a specific Git repository. So it's project specific. You are creating this username and email for this specific project. These information are saved at different locations. And your project specific username and email will override your user-specific username and email, and it will override your system username and email. So it's a hierarchic. The project takes the highest priority, your user takes second highest, your system takes the lowest priority. For now, I think you guys should be sufficient just create a user level username and email. That's probably most of the case, yeah. Once you have created that, you can check your configuration, git config and list. You can see, oh, that's my email, that's my username. So that's initial configuration. Now, when you need to set up a Git repository, there are two ways. One is to use Git Clone. So Git is a command line tool. If you know there's a existing Git repository, you can just download that repository. When you use Git Clone, it's different than Git pull. So Git Clone will clone a whole Git repository on the remote server. Every piece of history, snapshots or commits will be cloned. You are pulling down a whole chunk of history, the full history. And usually it's through the HTTP protocol, and there's some like GitHub or your company's Git repository, blah, blah, blah. So Git clone. If you have a blank project, you can use Git init. You need to navigate to the folder. So here we have Git demo, the directory, and I use Git init. It will initialize the Git repository. So if we list the files, by the way, these are Linux commands, so there should be similar commands under Windows. You can see this folder is empty, has nothing. Forget about the dot and double dot. Those are just for navigation, right? So this folder is completely blank. But if you use git init, you have created a Git repository under this folder. That is a hidden database. If you list all, you can see, hey, there's a .git file folder here. You can cd.git. You can list. You can see there are a bunch of files already. So that's how you create a Git repository from blank. You can either clone an existing repository from a remote server via this HTTP protocol or some other protocol, or you can just use git init to initialize a Git repository. There's a third way to create a Git repository. For example, if I create a folder and I use ng-generate or ng-new project 1 or something, this is the Angular command line tool. It will create an Angular project, blank Angular project with Git initialized, unless I have some option to disable Git for version control. So basically 3 ways to create a Git repository. One is download an existing or clone an existing Git repository. Second is git init in a folder. A third option is use your command line tool. Some software will build all the boilerplate code for you together with a Git repository, like Express.js. Express also, you use Express. The Express generator will create a backend project, skeleton or boilerplate backend project, and the Git will be initialized already. And it will do some other stuff for you, like ignoring certain files, which is quite convenient. So that's the 3 ways of creating a Git repository: Git init, Git clone, or use some other command line tools.